Good morning, everyone. I know a lot of people took advantage of our little papers outside that gave them the Zoom link. So we know that there's a lot of people on Zoom today. And they'll be asking questions and they'll be with us as well. My name is Camhi. How many people were here yesterday? Everyone. Oh, just a few. For those who weren't here yesterday, let me just give you a few housekeeping notices. First, could we all silence our phones, please? And while you're doing that, I'll tell you that the bathrooms are in the back there, around the corner, and then there's one outside near where you get water for a break. Okay? Now, we had a little difficulty yesterday with Zoom people. So we want to make sure that they all hear the questions. Dan is very eager to get questions from you because it's more of a conversation. But please wait and raise your hand. We'll bring you a mic. We'll bring you a microphone. But please wait until you can speak on the microphone so that the people on Zoom will be able to hear you. And I think that's all. Does everybody know about the luncheon that's going to be on Saturday, August 9th, which is this Saturday at Mannix 2? Both of the two presenters, Dan, who is here now, and Carlos Navarro, who is coming to speak. He'll be at the service on Sunday, and then he'll be speaking all of next week, Monday through Thursday. Oh, there's still people coming. Wonderful. You have a question? It's 12 o'clock at Mannix. And if you want, and they will be there, Carlos and Dan will be there to answer any questions at all. So they're a real good resource, so it'd be fun. There are 3 items that, Larry will be at the table outside. If you want to reserve a place at the luncheon, it's 250 pesos. The choices are chili and nogada, pollo and mole, and a vegetarian plate. And I've heard of a few people who need the vegetarian plate, but they want to know specifically what's on it. So I'll be getting that information today or tomorrow. I think that's all. Oh, today there's another group that will be here using the space at 12:30. So we're only having one intermission, and we will end the program at 12:30. Is that okay with everybody? Good. Okay. Well, there's nothing more. Let me introduce you to Dan. And I think instead of my giving you his credentials, he's going to give you his credentials. So welcome, everybody. Oh, what?
It's not true. We have it until 1.
We're stopping at 12:30.
Okay.
You never know.
All good? You can hear me now? Okay. Well, you don't need my credentials again, I don't think. Anyone who wasn't here yesterday?
Just call him Dr. Dan, and he'll be happy.
No, I don't like to be called Dr. Dan, actually, because then people ask me about their ear infection or something, you know. No, it's a pleasure, and pleasure to be with you, and I think we all have a great deal of knowledge about Mexico just from our experiences. I like to say that my own experience is, it took me a while to figure out while I was always early on, and still to some extent, but much less, but in the early years, bumping up against unexpected confusions or misunderstandings in cultural, in the exchange of information. And I realized that, you know, we come with different cultural templates. I like the idea of a template, which is something like a model that you can work with, but it's already fixed, you know, in your mind. And the Anglo sort of template has a certain expectations about how things are done, and there's a Mexican template with a lot of history behind it of expectation of how things are done. And I'm sure we've all run into that in many situations. And I really enjoyed the questions yesterday, and I encourage you also today, because it also gives me more things to work on and do my research. So I do have answers to some of the issues that were raised yesterday. And on the way in, I was kindly reminded of one that I hadn't researched. Is it Susan? The missionary style. I said, oh, I forgot about where did that come from, though, you know? And so I looked it up, and it turns out, although there is a common a story that it was from the missionaries trying to encourage, you know, colonial, the Christian missionaries from the English-speaking countries, actually, who supposedly encouraged that sexual position in their converts. But it was actually Alfred Kinsey, the sexual behavior person from the 1948 was his big book on sexuality, which was a revolutionary book in many ways. But he had it was a confluence of misunderstandings and things. But I thought it was kind of funny what people actually referred to that position. The French called it the classical position. Tuscans referred to it as the angelic position, while some Arabic-speaking groups call it in the manner of serpents. I'm not sure about that. But before Kinsey's work, the missionary position was known by several names, including the matrimonial, the mama-papa position, the English-American position, that's interesting, and the male superior position. Yeah. And then Kinsey came out with his report. So, so much for the missionary position. But there were some other questions, and one was on genetics. Well, there were two that were very much related, I think, genetics and disabilities. We talked about the fact that there was, if there was so much inbreeding, how did indigenous communities avoid genetic, variations that were not healthy or disabilities? And it turns out that there was a mix, and we can bring up some slides here. The first one, and I will talk about in 2024, there was some DNA analysis of a young child buried 700 years ago in a major ceremonial center in northern Mexico, where they found that the child had one of the most inbred genetic profiles ever discovered in ancient America. The child's parents were clearly siblings or extremely close relatives, much closer than first cousins. But this wasn't an accident or a tragedy. It was actually common among the elites. And this child was buried in the most sacred part of the city, so he was clearly part of the elite families, high status. And it was a way of royal inbreeding as a political strategy that rulers would use. And it was clear, it's most clearly evident in the people of Oaxaca, the Mixtec rulers of Oaxaca from about the years 1000 to 1500, where nearly 28% of royal marriages were between close relations. So it was severe enough, this inbreeding, to cause noticeable health problems. And you find that it wasn't just unique to the Americas, by the way. It was the pharaohs in Egypt. You find this in their genetic, what's that? The Habsburgs, yes. Yes, there's a much evidence of this. So it turns out that there are both high diversity communities and isolated communities, speaking of DNA. Some Maya groups, for instance, in the Yucatan Peninsula, their DNA has a high diversity, high genetic diversity. So, because they had extensive trade networks, interactions with neighboring people, and so they had large marriage pools to choose from in regular genetic exchange. But isolated communities, like the Lankondan Maya, if you've ever seen, they're in the rainforest in the south part. There's some wonderful documentaries. They're really one of the last undiscovered or left alone indigenous people. I mean, they are still living their life as they have lived for 1,000 years, for the most part. They stand in canoes and go down the rivers in these white, long white gowns. They're really interesting, Lankondan. So the other thing is that small populations face genetic challenges because it's kind of a genetic bottleneck that they face. When there's a dramatic, limited gene pool, you get a lot of disease. It's called sometimes the founder effect, like when small groups will establish a new settlement and then they have to breed among themselves. They only have a fraction of their original population's genetic diversity, and I like this comparison. It's like starting a new library with only a few books. So they had limited resources. So the health consequences, as we know, would be a lot of harmful genetic variants.
Dan,
yeah.
can we see that slide again?
Yeah, and I'm going to actually talk about it. If you want to leave it up. Yeah, I don't know, but you can go back to me or you can just leave it up. It's more interesting than watching me talk, I think, probably. Yeah, because they are related. The genetic issue leads right into the attitudes towards disabled or children born with various genetic problems. And I want to talk about how the ancient people ancient Americans treated people with disabilities. And it turns out that many of these cultures embraced them as sacred, powerful, and essential members of society. So before we talk about the Mayan in this case, just know that there's two understandings of disability. The medical approach says that it focuses on what a person's body can't do and tries to fix or cure the condition. A social approach recognizes that disability often comes from society's barriers, right? Not just individual differences. So a person using a wheelchair isn't disabled by their legs, they're disabled by stairs without ramps. So I kind of like thinking about that a little bit. It makes me ponder our attitude towards, where the disability really is, or the limitation. And the ancient American societies, the reason why this is relevant, is that they leaned heavily towards a social approach, creating accommodating communities rather than trying to fix people who were different, although there was some of that too. So in the Aztec world, disability was seen as a divine gift. It turns out that Montezuma created what may have been the first veterans hospital in 1500. Near Mexico City. It provided long-term care for soldiers injured in battle, which is interesting. They received medical treatment, housing, support, centuries before these kind of institutions appeared in Europe. But the Aztec support went far beyond the military care. They showed that they had medical treatments for people with mobility limitations, and had all sorts of health care that recognized different needs. There was a sacred status at the royal court as well. For instance, people with albinism, and somebody mentioned that yesterday, that albino people were treated in a special way. They were considered under direct protection of Tlaloc, the powerful rain god. So they had a very special status. People with dwarfism and spinal conditions were believed to have special access to the spirit world. And we'll talk about it in the Mayan context in a minute, where this artwork is from. But this is also in the Aztecs. So people born with dwarfism or these kind of conditions had special access. So there was a reason behind the way they appeared. That's how it was interpreted. They served as trusted advisors too, to rulers, and acted as intermediaries between human and the gods. And if you want to just flip to the next slide, and then we can come back to it, but they're related. Well, actually, there's a couple slides in here. So I'll go through the slides in a minute, but because they deal with the advisor role as well. So anyway, the Aztecs did have a formal teaching on this, the teaching of the elders that explicitly instructed citizens never to mock people with disabilities. So we have a record of this. They were taught to give disability or disabled individuals preferential respect and care. So this is one of the earliest documented disability rights programs, okay? They also had some gods with disabilities, which is interesting. And they were treated as heroes, not victims. So Nanahuatzin became the sun god because he was disabled and diseased, and yet he was the only deity brave enough to sacrifice himself by jumping into the fire to light the world, thus bringing about the sun. This made disability part of the cosmic order. It wasn't an unfortunate accident. And so in the Mayan, finally, the sacred power of difference is the issue here, is that the archaeology in this area shows that Mayan art and burial sites reveal a lot of respect for people with dwarfism, elaborate ceramic figures, so you can flip between the first one and this one. If you want to move between the slides a little bit. Yeah, that's the third one if you want to. So these are all representations of dwarfism in people. I think let's go on. I brought my own slides as well today, so I know where we are. Go ahead. Yeah, this one. Let's stay with this one for a second. So I even brought a pointer. Does that show up there? So you got the ruler in the middle, and then a dwarf on either side, or a dwarfed person with dwarfism. And there's a sense of counseling, dialogue going on here in this image. And if I could read the hieroglyphs, there's a message there, but it does give you an appreciation of the people who were able to break this code, and actually there are people who know what these images actually mean, which is extraordinary. But there are elaborate ceramic figures that show people with dwarfism wearing expensive turbans, ceremonial clothing. There are stone carvings depict them standing in places of honor, next to rulers during important ceremonies, which is probably what's going on here, because the image in the middle has the headdress, right? And he's sitting cross-legged, which is a sign of power, on a throne of some sort. And he's got the jewelry of royalty as well. So they almost seem like they're attendants, they're attending on the ruler here. So there's many artistic representations in the Mayan world of people with dwarfism, more than anywhere else in the world, in fact, is what researchers say. So they had special roles and responsibilities. And there are creation myths as well in the Mayan world, describe an earlier world inhabited by people with dwarfism, which is interesting, who could see to the ends of space and time, who built magnificent stone cities, created beautiful art, and wrote prophetic books, and were transformed into stone when a new age began. And apparently modern Mayan people still maintain some of these beliefs of spirit guardians are often depicted as having dwarfism, and they protect the crops and ancient sites. Okay, so let's move on. Another image, several images of dwarfism. And then let's move to the next one. Here we have somebody with the hunched back condition. And this is from the Inca world. I just put it in here because I thought it was an interesting image. Oops, where did you go? That's interesting. So that slide, I guess you're only seeing half of it. Yeah.
Wait, please.
Oh, yeah, please wait for the microphone.
It looks a lot of, what was that, Monte Alban. Has everybody
Yeah,
made
that's
that
the right side,
comparison?
yeah. I thought some of my slide got cut off. I think the way I set up that slide, it's not anything you're doing back there. There is another image that isn't on that slide about with a fellow on a llama. But the image on the right that you can see there, I wanted to reference because they are the danzantes from Monte Alban, which I talked about yesterday, as being these mysterious figures in relief stone. There's a series of them, and people have speculated, were they people with disabilities? Were they people dancing? Because they're in these unusual positions. But it turns out that the most likely explanation is that they had disease conditions because they have certain growths on their bodies, and they seem to be kind of writhing in pain. They may have been captives as well. So it is a mysterious setting that hasn't quite been understood, but they may be related also to disability. So I just wanted to put that in. Unfortunately, my other part of the slide, I didn't get into the image area, but I can show it at another time. But if we move on to the next slide, what I wanted to show you is that there was actually a great deal of medical care for people with issues, including in the Inca world in Peru, successful brain surgery that was actually documented with the Smithsonian as having better outcomes likely than brain surgery during the Civil War. Because all surgery during the Civil War was pretty brutal. There was no sense of germ contagion, and doctors would stick their dirty hands inside the body looking for a bullet or something. And obviously those people had a lot of trauma from bullets and things. But in the Inca world, we're not quite sure why they were drilling skulls. We think it might have been to relieve pressure. And over time, they did this over centuries, and they learned to make smaller holes and avoid certain areas that bleed a lot. And so they can tell, archaeologists, from whether a skull has healed somewhat after a surgery, whether they were successful. Some of them probably weren't successful, but actually some brain surgery was successful. So there was a lot of medical work going on for pain relief, and this may have also applied again to disabled people, and long-term personal care with daily tasks. There's even also in the Mayan community the use of complex sign language that research believes descends from ancient systems of signing for deaf people. So they appear also to have to have been accommodated and function as society members. So I think why it matters today, other than that it was brought up, and even though it's away from the focus, the main focus, but when I said yesterday that all history is family history in a way, these people would have been cast out by their families if they hadn't been, if the society didn't accept. In fact, that is still an issue in areas of the world where a disabled child might be left to die. And much closer to home, I can tell you from personal experience in Puerto Vallarta, we have a program at the International Friendship Club where we help children with cleft palate in that condition. And we often hear about children second or third hand because their parents are ashamed to come forward when a child is born, thinking it's some sort of a curse, that was something about their, their life or their relationship. And so I had an experience where we went to visit a family and they had the child in the back room hidden away. This is an infant, and of course with this condition they can't nurse until they either get some sort of surgical help or special nursing bottles that can accommodate a child whose palate isn't closed, it's open. So, and they said the child was starving to death until we were notified and we were able to get them into the program. And so we have a before and after picture of this little boy, after receiving care, and he's this very healthy young child now. But so the attitude towards disability is very much, part and parcel of all family situations. And so I think it's interesting that they really incorporated this deeply into their societies. So that was a good research for me. And then now we'll come back to the themes of the week as I had already planned them. So we can go to the next slide, which should be Sorwana, I hope. Yeah, okay. So I want to talk a little bit about Sorwana and what she represents. Most of you have heard of Sorwana. I know you've all seen her. Why have you all seen her? If you pulled out a 200 peso bill, at least one version, I'm not sure if the current one, does it still have only her? Because there was time when they were going to replace her, and that created a big uproar. Who's on right now? Who's on the 200s? Is she still on there? Anybody have a 200? Yeah. She's there, good. Oh, okay. Is that a 200 or 100? 100. Oh, she's on the 100. I think she got demoted. Well, at least she's still there. Who's on the 200 now? Is it well, anyway. Mm-hmm. As if they're, like no one's as original as Sorwana, right? So I thought I'd just tell you a little bit about this woman, this remarkable woman, because she really is. And if you have any questions about her or you've heard anything about her. But she was born around Puebla, around the volcanic mountain there in Napantla. And she was, of course, born into the 17th century, like about 1645, I think is when she was born. Very beautiful young girl, but also brilliant. And so you have a whole story here of genius constrained by gender, basically, where she had these exceptional talents. She had an uncle and he had a library. By 3, she was speaking Latin and Greek. She taught herself. She wanted to go to university on through school, and girls weren't permitted, so she cut her hair and dressed as a boy. She wanted to get into school, and she was that determined. Because in colonial Mexico, there were 3 options for women. Marriage, which usually meant, long pregnancies, one after the other, and basically confinement in the home. You could stay single, but you'd be quite vulnerable in a colonial setting as a single woman on your own, and very limited options. Or you could go into religious life. Now, because of Sorwana's brilliance and a fortunate connection, she was invited as an adolescent to the royal court in Mexico City, where the viceroy held sway and had his, court. This would be, of course, all the representatives from Spain, right? So this is colony of Spain, so the viceroy literally means what? Standing in the place of the king, right? And so she was at court for a couple of years, had many suitors, was determined not to marry because she could see, what it would do with her intellectual freedom. She had the protection of the viceroy and his wife. She was like a favorite of theirs, so she was allowed to have her books and her writing, and she began to flourish. And then she decided, as a strategic move, really, more than a, sort of a deeply religious motivation from what we can tell, she joined a convent. And she chose one that was, deliberately chose one that is more flexible so that she could have a private cell or room with library. She ended up with the largest library, 4,000 books. Largest private collection in the Americas. It was, her private study was transformed into her private cell into a comprehensive sort of study. There was a nice movie made in the 1990s. It's in Spanish, but it is available with subtitles. Yo la peor de todas, if you want to. I, the worst of all. La peor de todas. So that, I can explain that title near the end of her life, but the director's name, Luisa Bamberg, I think, she's an Argentinian, and she's very famous. Anyway, it's a wonderful rendition of Sor Juana's life, and it brings it to life in a way that it's really difficult to do with words, but she had scientific instruments. She was, kind of a Da Vinci type. She was brilliant in science, brilliant in literature, brilliant in art. Musical instruments, she had art supplies. So she had a space for female scholarship, and she wrote poetry, plays. One of her famous poems is Hombres Necios, foolish men. Hombres Necios. And I should have made a copy of the whole poem because it has some wonderful lines in it, but I'll see if I can reproduce one of the punchlines, which is, so who would you say sins more? The woman, or who is the worst? A woman who sins for money out of need, or a man, no, let's see. A woman who sins for pay, or a man who pays for sin? Yeah. Who should be judged more harshly, right? And she challenged gender norms in a lot of her writing. So you can look up that Foolish Men poem. I think you'll enjoy it. And she had theatrical works that were produced at the convent. So again, the convent life could be quite rich. It was a female controlled space, surrounded by male, dominated society, but within the enclosure, and within the limitations allowed, there was still a bishop overseeing them and all sorts of male, spiritual whatever, supervisors or whatever, but the women ran the convent. They had an abbess, a mother superior, or whatever, and they voted on things. And but there's also class consciousness here in that the wealthier convents, you had to pay a dowry to get in. It was like marrying, you were a bride of Christ, right? So you had to pay the dowry. But you could also bring a servant with you if you had the means, So very interesting. Convents also ended up being, coincidentally, oh, you okay? Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you for the interruption. Before you go on from the library, did she, since Da Vinci was from Italy, and he was previous to her, would she have been able to get some of his writings?
Absolutely. I mean, really, until the Reformation, those kind of writings that came over that had religious themes, they were censored. All books were screened by the Inquisition, by the way, when they came in from off the boats. And this became a problem for Sor Juana's literature to get it out of Mexico and to get it published. She wasn't going to get it published in Mexico, right? So the viceroy and his wife put it into their cargo, their stuff, because that wasn't checked. They had, diplomatic immunity. So that's how her works got to Spain and were published. And there's a whole collection of her works. But she did have, she had the latest astronomy from Europe, and she was reading and, making sightings and charting the stars. And I'm sure she was aware of, Da Vinci and others, sure.
Only when he's talking about books.
Oh, yeah.
So would she have had access to Bartolomé de las Casas, who wrote about Columbus in the Caribbean?
Well, that's a good question, because de las Casas, his writings were quite critical of the colonial enterprise, and the treatment of indigenous. His Cartas de las Relaciones de las Indias. And then they were quite, the scandal in Europe. I'm not sure how welcome they actually would have been into the colonial world. It's a good question, whether they were available. However, I will say that because he was a Dominican, he was a religious order, and so they would have had copies, I'm sure, and they were very present in Mexico. So she may have had access. I wouldn't be surprised if she hadn't read de las Casas. And so she got into a little bit of a problem, though, in 1691. So Sor Juana only lived 40 years, if you can imagine. Such a brilliant person, and sadly, or let's see, 1645 to 95. I guess that's 50 years, huh? But anyway. In 1691, she wrote a criticism or a response. There was a movement in the church at that time to sort of keep women in their place intellectually. And there was a bishop, the Bishop of Puebla actually, who wrote a critique of women in convent life, but he disguised it. He wouldn't put his own name on it. He actually put Sister Filateo. He used a pseudonym of another sister as if it was coming from a sister. Everyone knew, or at least Sor Juana knew, everyone knew this bishop apparently was famous for being rather misogynist. And she wrote a response, a reply to that, and had it published. And she made an argument that women possess the same intellectual capacities as men. And she had all sorts of historical precedents from the Bible as well as other of strong women and leaders, and also religious figures like Saint Teresa of Avila, who was quite a brilliant author, other learned women. Well, this didn't go over so well with the authorities in Mexico, and they demanded that she give up all of her books. They silenced her. They forced her to sign a confession of wrongdoing. And in this confession, she actually, what she did with it is she created this ironic sort of response where she said, yes, I am the worst of all. That's the yo la peor de todas. That's how she signed it. Saying, oh yes, I've done a terrible, terrible thing, dear fathers, and I can't be forgiven. And she really took it over the top. And it said that she even signed it with her own blood, like she, pricked her finger. At least in the movie they did that. Maybe for dramatic effect, I'm not sure. The real source on this is Octavio Paz, who wrote Sor Juana, or The Traps of the Faith, Trampas de la Fe. It's about a 600-page tome. And I actually remember, because it was my first graduate course, I read that in Spanish as my assignment to write a paper. And I was doing this on a trip, educational trip to Oaxaca, so it was an interesting summer. But I never regretted reading that book and getting interested in Sor Juana, because she's been a source of ongoing interest and admiration. And there was a whole movement in the 90s and 2000, the first decade, particularly to re-examine Sor Juana as a feminist figure. Even some people said she must have been a lesbian, she was so close to the wife of the viceroy. But, I think many people say it's a little dangerous to read back into time about relationships, with a modern attitude. We were talking about this yesterday. Somebody at the break said, I don't think people, the idea of like an individual sexual identity or something is a very modern concept in a lot of ways. So I think the fact that she had this close bond with, could have actually been two women who were constrained by institutions. I mean, think about being the wife of the viceroy, What are your options there, right? Anyway, so yes, she was silenced. It was very sad. And she ended up her life, she died caring for her sisters during an epidemic of 1695. There were many epidemics in colonial Mexico. The streets were swampy, was built on a lake, and it really never had good drainage. It still doesn't, to be honest. But anyway, she is a kind of an archetype. So, and I think if you go on with the slides, we have her convent has been restored. That's the original. If the next slide has been restored and turned into a museum, and then the next one is the interior. So that looks nice, doesn't it?
Where is it?
It's in Mexico City. It's just a couple blocks from the main Zocalo, and you can go visit. And it's a great museum, and it gives you a sense too of the comfort or the wealth of these convents. And that's what I was going to get to when we started with the questions, which I'm glad you asked. Convents actually were the wealthiest institutions in colonial Mexico. Why was that so? Because they received a lot of bequeaths in the wills and testaments. A lot of people gave to the sisters, the good sisters, for hopefully for a better afterlife, right? And so they ended up being a source of financing. They had properties. This was a real issue after Mexico's independence. The church had all the wealth. There was no bank in independent Mexico. You had to go to the church for loans, and the church had quite a business going with loans. But that's a little field of Sor Juana. But I think she is she does stand out, but also represents, I think, the possibilities and the fact that many women in their own way were finding a space or creating space in these institutions, okay? Good.
It's a normal one this time.
No more positions, right?
Were most of the convents like Franciscan or Jesuit or Dominican, or were there the different flavors or branches
Orders,
or whatever
yeah.
they're called of Catholicism? Which one would run the convents?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, there was a variety of, some of them were run by, you have basically two structures in the church, the orders, which are called the regulars, the religious orders. That would be, in the case of Mexico, was the Franciscans first. They were the first. 12 of them came over with Cortez on his, I believe it was his second trip, not his first one, but he went back and forth a few times. But they were like the 12 apostles. That was the idea, So the Franciscans were first and very powerful. Then the Dominicans and the Jesuits would follow, and a couple of other orders. Many of them had a female equivalent or sister organization that had a convent. It would sometimes have a different name. But there were also convents founded in the spirit of a woman, like St. Teresa of Avila or other great, religious figures. But I'm not sure that, well, St. Geronimo was her convent, so St. Jerome, now he's an early saint from a biblical scholar, actually. Interesting that he was the first translator of the Latin, the Vulgate, thank you. He created the first Latin Bible from sources. But anyway, so he may have been, it may have been the order of St. Jerome that she belonged to. It's a good question. I'm not quite sure how they identified with the male orders per se. I do know that they all had male spiritual advisors that they would, and have to kind of consult with, but they were under the bishop's authority very much so. Yeah. A question in the back. Do we have a microphone near there? You've got one. Okay.
If her work was suppressed and she had to give up her library, how did her work survive?
Her work survived because the viceroy and his wife shipped them out for her. They would come visit her in the convent. The viceroyina, the wife of the viceroy, was a frequent visitor with her, and then she would take things out with her own belongings because she couldn't be frisked or anything, obviously. And yeah, that's how they got out. They went back to Spain. They were published in Spain, became a huge sensation. I think Primer Sueño is considered her masterwork. It's a poem, First Dream. I've actually looked at it. There's a lot of classical allusions, to Aphrodite from this and this. It's in a style that is a little bit remote from our own style, I would say. But then she had those small little poems like Hombres Necios, She also wrote songs, villancicos, I think they're called. And she would, they'd be performed at the holidays. They always asked, Sor Juana, can you create a song for us? She was that kind of brilliance. So yeah, that's how they survived, thankfully, because of that connection. Okay, so let's move on to the caste system, I think, which is, well, let's look at, I do have this other, I want to give you a sense of the size of some of these convents. This is Izamal on the Yucatan. It's called the Golden City. You've been there? Yeah, it's really spectacular, and that's the convent at the center of it. And you just to get the scope of the size of the compound that and it was quite a popular destination for. I mean, there would be convents for all sorts of reasons. Women who were pregnant but not married would have places to go. There would be poor women might have an option for convent life, but where they wouldn't need a dowry, but they would live in simpler conditions. And okay, So let's move on. Yeah. So I wanted to come back to this notion of the stratification of society, colonial society, and, you know, where a woman, well, not just women, but people found their places. And I couldn't read some of these little phrasings yesterday, so I brought my own. So starting in the upper left, we have Español con India. That's a mestizo. Okay. Next to that is mestizo con española. That's castizo. So now you've got, you know, the mestizo, the mestizo in this case would have been a male child born of the Spanish and Indian, creates a mestizo, and then the mestizo grows up and he's sort of half Spanish, right? So if he marries a Spanish, their child is 3/4 Spanish, right? It's castizo, a little bit higher. And then if you have a castizo marrying back with a Spanish, castizo con española, they're Español. They've been fully recovered. They've been all cleansed, you know, all white. They're, yeah, been through the filter a few times. Then to the far right there, you have Español con mora, is a mulatto. So the mora, I guess, in this case would be a black person. There were various terms for a black person. The second row, you have mulatto con española. So remember, the mulatto would be the child of a Spanish and a black person. So the mulatto con español is a Morisco. And I think they have cookies named Moriscos.
Moros y Cristianos.
Oh,
where
yeah.
It's white rice and black beans. I
Okay.
forget if that was Cuba, but Moros y Cristianos.
Yeah. And I think, yeah. Morisco con española is a Chino. That's the second one in the second row. That's a Chino. A Chino con an India, is a salta atrás. That's a step back. Take a step back. Salta atrás with a mulata is a lobo. Lobo. You know, if you speak Spanish, what is that? A wolf. Pretty demeaning. Yeah. Third row, lobo con china is a cribaro. I think that's the word. Some of these words are just, they only exist in the cast painting system, yeah. It's jibaro, yeah, jibaro, which I think is like a worker of some sort. Jibaro con mulata, albarazado. Albarazado con negra, cambujo. Cambujo con India, sanbago. Then we got down to the last row, sambago con loba, calpo mulata. So we're getting darker and darker here in the tones, right? Calpo mulata con cabujo is tente en aire. Tente en el aire. It's kind of being suspended in the air, like kind of nowhere. Tente en el aire con mulata. No te entiendo. I don't understand you. No te entiendo. No te entiendo con India. Torno atrás. Turning back or a step back. I mean, it's almost inconceivable. And what I have to say is that these paintings were created by an artist. I
Dan?
doubt that anyone on, is there a question or what?
Right me here.
Yeah.
So we are going from the highest to the lowest caste.
Well, in terms of color, you can see how it's, yeah, gradually getting darker, and that's considered lower, yeah.
Lower, okay.
You can kind of see it sometimes, maybe in the images themselves. Let's see if, I wasn't really paying attention, but yeah, in the upper row, you know, you've got people dressed rather elegantly, and then you get down to the bottom, and it's pretty much working world. Yeah, question?
I think what seems to be interesting is that they were allowed to marry anybody
Well,
you wanted. I mean, that's an interesting, I mean, despite the
yeah,
discrimination,
good point.
if you read the chart that way, I mean, they could marry anybody from any caste.
It's a great point because, you know, obviously it was illegal, right? Miscegenation, you know, the mixing of the races, you know, that was serious stuff. I think there's a lot of theories about that. I kind of pointed a little bit towards that with, you know, is it that the Catholic worldview embraces, Catholic means universal, right? So it's the big tent philosophy that everyone has to have a place in the Catholic universe. So, you know, they all have to be accepted in one sense. You can't cast people out. There's not an in-group or completely out-group. The other might just be demographic necessity, you know, when you're dealing with the Spanish, for instance, coming over were mostly men. I mean, the women who came later on would come if their husbands had established themselves and had something to offer, but it was a difficult journey and it's hard to give up life in Madrid, you know, for life on the unknown, you know, open lands with a lot of unusual and perhaps hostile people around. So yeah, it might have been necessity in some sense. But yeah, there was a much more tolerance and a sort of a gradation. And after a while, I was going to say, as you walk down the streets in colonial Mexico City, you're not going to be pointing people out and saying, oh, castizo, mestizo, morisco. You know, I don't think that was the case. However, when it came to marriage, sometimes, you know, that became important. If there was money involved, inheritance involved. I think I have, let's move on to the next painting. I've got more on the cast. Here I just gave a little bit of a close-up, I think, on a couple of other paintings. There are many versions of the paintings, too. But those are two that, can you read them there? Español con India is a mestizo, and yeah.
On the bottom right, they're barefooted of what you had before.
Oh, good.
And they're carrying baskets like if they're selling things in the streets.
Yes.
Whereas at the top, they're wearing stockings, shoes with buckles, little bitty heels. So it definitely is top to
Yeah.
bottom, almost like the bottom is the untouchables in India.
Yes. Although I don't think there was ever anything comparable to an untouchable class, but they were definitely the informal economy in the street. But the fact that so many people were working in this way, the only women who had mobility were the poorer women because they had to get out and make a living somehow, and a lot of them were single mothers. And so they moved around, but because of their lower status, it wasn't considered so important that they be confined, you know. The whole notion of honor and confinement applied to wealthy families who felt like their daughters were their property and had to be watched over, and their daughters reflected their family's honor as well. So, yeah, I think the clothing is a very good example of gives, you know, signals status. So it was a very status conscious society. You know, people would read the signals. And even to this day, the question is, who is an indigenous Mexican? Is it someone what are the requirements to consider yourself indigenous? Do you have to speak the language? If you don't speak Mayan, can you be a Mayan person? if you don't dress in traditional indigenous, clothing, are you still indigenous? So, I think the self-definition would be that like when I've been to Merida, those people still, they consider themselves Mayan, they are Mayan. Spanish is their first language. Many of them speak very little Mayan at this point if they're younger, But anyway, I think what you see is that there's both a lot of importance placed on it in certain levels of society, but also some flexibility. And actually, that's what I want to talk about next. But let me just check the time. We're at 11:04. I think this is probably a good time because we're going to take one break. So let's take our break and come back in about 10 minutes, and we'll pick it up. Thanks. Okay, shall we pick up our case here and move it on? I got a lot of interesting, all the comments over the break were very interesting. Appreciate them very much. I thought I'd share a couple of things that came up, great insights. The Moorish influence on Spain. Are you all aware that from about the 800s to the 1400s, there was a Islamic control of much of Spain, most of it at one point, and then gradually a reconquista, a reconquest of Spain from the north moving south, of pushing the Moors out of Spain. But the influence of that culture would have had, quite an impact, especially on the notions of enclosure of women and young girls. We all know about the honor killings in a lot of Islamic communities, or not a lot, but the ones that are, following the strict Sharia law. Yes?
Yeah, there's a great book about this. The title of the book is The Ornament of the World: How Muslims, Jews, and Christians Created a Culture of, basically a culture of cooperation in that time frame.
Yeah, there was a flourishing, and I'm glad you point that out. It wasn't all, there were various periods. I mean, a 600-year period, that's a long time. That's longer than, more than twice as long as the U.S. has been a nation anyway. In that period, there was a flourishing around the 1100s where a lot of great scientific and artistic work was being done in Moorish Spain. It was a great tolerance among the religious traditions for a while. I just want to stress it was for a while. It didn't last. But yeah, and there's great fiction books too. I wish if I think of some of the titles, sometimes good historical fiction is a way to really learn about an era like this, which is so different from our own. But thank you. It's a fascinating period in its own right. One of the results, though, was that the Spanish, when they came over, they had an attitude of conquest from day one. And I think the harshness and the brutality of the conquest of the Americas in part comes out of a mentality of, destroying the heathens, basically. Spain, as a reaction to Moorish influence, had this Catholic, very strong Catholic orthodoxy identity. So it played out in a lot of ways in the Americas, but it's a good point. In fact, it leads very well into the Inquisition, which is up ahead, because we'll talk about the year 1492, for instance, is very significant. Not just for Columbus's voyage, but two other things happened. in the same year. It's an interesting year. It was the final conquest or the fall of the last Moorish stronghold in Spain, which I believe was Toledo, but don't quote me on that. Granada, thank you. And it was also the year that the decree went out that Jews would have to either convert or leave Spain and leave behind everything. And that was part of this strong Catholic Orthodoxy reaction, was to, cast out all people, and as well as just a long tradition of anti-Semitism once again appearing. Yes?
The Ottoman Empire was very willing to take the Jews from Spain who were cast out. And they lived in harmony for many, many years in the Ottoman Empire. And I happen to be a descendant both from the Turks. My family moved to Turkey. So it's very interesting. Thank you.
Oops, I may have, thanks. Yeah, I mean, we're moving away from an area I have a great deal of background in, but I am aware that there was gradations of acceptance and at different times and places of different groups. But the impact on the Americas would have been one of suspicion and intolerance. In fact, when the Inquisition was set up, it was primarily targeting, what are called crypto Jews. What they called crypto Jews would be people who said they converted but were still carrying on with, Jewish traditions. And I think one of the books might be The Last Jew, is a title. I was thinking about historical fiction about this time in Spain. But for instance, on the Sabbath, the Friday evening, one of the signals, if you were looking to gather for a Seder, people would put a lit candle in their window. And that was a signal that there was a family, that you could join a underground Seder at that place. And we'll see how it plays out a bit in the Americas and Mexico. So thank you for that. And yeah, the Moorish influence on enclosure and on women, I think, is important to note. Also the caste system, who created that exactly? I'm having a little trouble here with my mic. Was it the artists who created those categories, or the Hispanic elites? And I think, as I did a quick check, I think the elites had an interest, because they were a minority, in making sure that their status was protected, at the top of the chain. We're talking about the peninsulars, the people who came over from Spain. They wanted to make sure that their position was not challenged, and that it was easily, that they clearly were set apart as Spanish, both peninsular and then Creole, the Spanish, but born in Mexico, of Spanish parentage, pure blood Spanish, right? So they had an interest in maintaining that status. But I think the remarkable thing is to see the mixing, the open mixing of the various, categories, and it was so that's significant. So what I want to talk about next is the struggle for freedom within this, caste-like situation, and very constrained. And so if you'd bring up the slide again. We have a close-up here. The one you're seeing is a mestizo close-up, and the reason I put this one in, the child is a mestizo, but showing off his learning to his mother, you know, showing that part of the Spanish influence in the household would have been to bring education. So it's kind of like a signal that, you know, the Spanish influence is educating the son in culture. The next slide leads me also to a story I'd like to tell you. This is, again, with the Spanish and a mulata, we have a morisco, right? So I want to tell you the story of one of these mulatas and her struggle for freedom. Her name is Maria de la Candelaria, and she demonstrates how enslaved people in colonial Mexico exercised agency and fought for their freedom through the Spanish legal system. So although there was enslavement or forced servitude, there was also the ability to challenge that within the system, which is kind of remarkable, because when you think about chattel slavery as it appeared in the US or in the Caribbean or Brazil, you know, plantation slaves had very few resources. They weren't going to court with their cases, you know. But in the, you know, colonial empire, Spain's colonial empire, they did actually set up various kinds of tribunals, church as well as civil, and petitions could be heard from anyone in the community. Whether they'd be honored or not would be another question, but Maria's story is that her background was that she was purchased as a child along with her siblings by Antonio de los Reyes, who was the owner of a hacienda in eastern Mexico. She actually became a direct slave of Antonio's wife, while her siblings were sold to his father-in-law. So families broken up, very common. And at age 14, Antonio forced Maria to become his mistress through physical violence and threats of lashings. This is all from her testimony. She suffered constant harassment and abuse throughout her enslavement. She bore 2 children to Antonio. Her daughter died, her second daughter lived. And Antonio did raise the surviving daughter as his own biological child, making promises for Maria's freedom, but not delivering. She did, at his wife's death, because she technically belonged to his wife, at his wife's death, she had a statement of freedom, a manumission it's called, that she was now free, but Antonio refused to honor that and kept her enslaved. Until a local priest publicly condemned Antonio's transgressions at a Holy Week service. So she must have gone to the priest. And so priests often would perform this function of calling out the community. That's what Bartolomé de las Casas was doing, right? He was preaching along with the other Dominicans, and this was back in the Caribbean in the first decades after the Columbus, saying, you know, you're destroying these communities, and they would stand up in church and castigate the colonial authorities. And so they were using their moral authority, and in this case, the priest pressured Antonio to marry Maria, which was a common practice that the church would encourage between masters and, you know, enslaved women that they were, you know, impregnating and things too. Antonio refused, and so the priest removed Maria from the hacienda and sheltered her temporarily with his own relatives and facilitated her departure from the hacienda. She was in poor health, alone in Mexico City, but she went to sue Antonio for damages. and she ended up in a criminal court rather than the church court, the ecclesial court, which was unusual for the time, but she sought some compensation for those years of service, loss of liberty, her own violation. She wanted custody of her daughter as well. And in her formal appeal, she demanded justice for being, quote, deflowered, for having her virginity taken when she was very young, forced into a 12-year relationship as his mistress, physical abuse, threats, and maltreatment, broken promises of freedom, years of unpaid service. And the court ruled, this was 1706, to give you a sense of the time frame, the judge ordered Maria and her daughter placed in protective custody in Puebla. A week later, they ruled that both Maria and her daughter would be set free and prohibited Antonio from pursuing or harassing them. There is no record of Antonio being forced to pay any kind of compensation for those years, however. Nevertheless, the significance is, I think, that the Spanish did have a legal framework. They had this medieval law system, the siete partidas I mentioned, and it prohibited cruel punishment, family separation, excessive cruel treatment and excessive punishment, starvation, sexual exploitation of enslaved people. Slave marriages were one avenue to freedom, and so there gradually became a mixed race, free population in Mexico. And somebody had asked me earlier about the role of slavery and the importation of Africans, because there being such a large indigenous population for labor, there wasn't the demand as much for African labor. But early on, there had been actually importation when there was a demographic collapse of the first generation of indigenous, from smallpox and all these, contagious diseases, as well as overwork, loss of will to live. Women would drown their newborns rather than raise them in that situation. This happened a lot in the Caribbean, where the collapse was complete. There are no indigenous people in the Caribbean. The DNA of the Taino people is still present. You can find it in current Caribbean, residents, but their whole world was destroyed. So early on, Africans were brought in as a temporary measure. They also had one other advantage in that they had immunity or resistance anyway to smallpox, because they'd been exposed to it centuries earlier, because Europeans and Africans had been interacting, and there was actually a slave trade between Europe and Africa much earlier than the Americas. So you do have an African-Mexican population, and to this day in areas of Veracruz and Oaxaca. And Maria was somewhere in this category of, she had African roots. I'm not sure if she was, also one caste or another in the mixture. But anyway, I think Maria's case demonstrates that even enslaved women had some agency and self-determination. They could go to court. They could make their case. And that she never really viewed herself as truly enslaved. She felt like she was more of a captive. And I think that's significant. It kind of gives you a sense of the attitude. And how women navigated patriarchal and racial hierarchies, so they could use the system available. And indigenous people made a lot of claims to these courts, not just, women about these kinds of issues, but indigenous labor and land claims, tribute and labor disputes. Okay, so I just thought, it's just a one case study. Yeah.
One comment from earlier and then a good comment on what you just said. Christopher Columbus, 1492, Columbus saved the ocean blue, all that. Christopher Columbus in Spanish is Cristobal Colon, and we all know that Cristobal, Christ, he came to Catholicize, y Colon, he came to colonize. Cristobal Colon. Okay. Second, with the mixed race history and background in Mexico of so many, we had here in Mexico the people coming from Southern Europe, hence Spanish, that area, North America, or not North America, Canada and the US had English, so they were whiter, but I read, or in one of my classes, they said that Mexicans have blood like ditch water, but then the Mexicans take it another level and say, they call themselves La Raza Cósmica, because it's such a mixture of people from many, many places. They turn it around to say that they're at a higher level. La Raza Cósmica. But blood like ditch water, that could be seen true also. But darker, Southern Europe, Northern America, we have mixtures, e pluribus unum, whiter, English language, blah, blah, blah.
Thanks, yeah. Well, the La Raza Cósmica actually, that comes about after the Mexican Revolution in the 1920s. You have José Vasconcelos is the author of a book called La Raza Cósmica. He was the first education secretary after the revolution, and he wanted to ennoble the Mexican identity, which had been treated more like ditchwater mixtures, which is, that we need more European blood, that whole movement. There was a whole whitening ideology around the year 1890 to 1910. This is during Porfirio Diaz, where he wanted to bring in more Europeans, not just in Mexico. All through Latin America, they were saying, come and join us. That's where a lot of Germans and Italians would go to Argentina. Brazil had the same thing going on. We need more white people, more white blood. And, the Mexican people were trying to figure out, how do we fit into this, We'll never measure up. And Jose Vasconcelos said, we don't need to measure up. We're a step above. We're a cosmic race, We're this new mixture that is richer, more powerful. And he was, being the education secretary, he commissioned all those murals that Diego Rivera painted, and Jose Clemente and Orozco, and those were educational projects. So when you have an illiterate people who can't read, which is at the time of the revolution about 80% of Mexicans probably didn't read, the mural is a historical lesson. It's a lesson in history, and you can see how that race would play out on a lot of those murals. And so it became a way of, claiming their own identity in a proud way. So thank you for bringing that up. I think it's a wonderful lesson. Let's go ahead and move on to something really juicy, I think. The Inquisition, that's always fun, right? It's Monty Python, right? The Inquisition. But in terms of, particularly, I want to look at how it played out in terms of witchcraft and women and how they were treated. So let's bring up a slide here, if we could. So this is the building that housed the Mexican Inquisition. It's in Mexico City. Oops. Okay, and I want to say a couple general words about how the Mexican Inquisition differed from the Spanish Inquisition of Spain before I zero in on the witchcraft question. So there was, because it was a different kind of Inquisition. It began in Spain in 1478 as a joint venture between the monarchy and the Catholic Church, and it was designed to bring about this religious uniformity after having completed the Reconquista, right? To drive Muslim rulers from Spain. We have King Ferdinand and Queen Isabel, turning their attention to eliminating religious diversity in their empire. So what had been their strength earlier with the jewel, of this bringing together of the different religious traditions with tolerance and all that, there was a definite, a new order here with the Catholic monarchs, as they're called, Ferdinand and Isabel. So the 1492 decree, Alhambra decree, gave Spanish Jews, the choice to convert or leave the country. And it extended to all the colonies, okay, including Mexico. However, a lot of what they were called conversos, the people who said they converted, they would actually cross the Atlantic hoping for a fresh start and some freedom, being away from the main capital of Spain. So in Mexico, the Inquisition did serve a dual purpose, maintaining Catholic orthodoxy and also supporting colonial rule. But in Europe, the focus had primarily been Jews and Muslims. But in Mexico, the Inquisition had to, navigate a very complex, multicultural society with indigenous people, and enslaved Africans, Europeans, mixed-race populations. So who was targeted? So let's go to the next slide. And this is the rooting out of crypto-Jews, okay? So there was this tragic case of Luis Carvajal, who was, he was a royal governor of Nuevo León, where Monterrey is today, but he had a lot of powerful enemies who discovered his Jewish ancestry. Even though he wasn't practicing Judaism, some of his family members still were. So he was hauled into Inquisition's Mexico City jail in 1591, where he died. And remember, this is a governor. He was at the level of governor. And his relatives were burned at the stake. Let's go to the next slide. Yeah. This is where his relatives were. So there were cases of burning at the stake, particularly for people who were believed to still practice Judaism and were not going to, they were either forced to claim Christ as their Savior, or they were burned at the stake. So some people refused to do that. So that was part of the Inquisition. Now, indigenous people, I think I mentioned yesterday, they were protected by royal decree. They could not be prosecuted. If they hadn't converted to Christianity, they were not subject to the Inquisition. However, for sexual offenses, they could be prosecuted. So they, both men and women could be prosecuted for adultery and other sexual infractions. Interestingly, unfaithful husbands were more often targeted than wives. So that's something positive in a way, I suppose you could say. Or it was perhaps because it was more common, who knows. But also sorcery and witchcraft, which became a major focus. So why don't we go to the next slide? So this became this was a little different than in Europe. In Spain, the theologians were basically skeptical about witchcraft. They were skeptical. They were more concerned with, Jews and Muslims. than accusations of dark magic. But in Mexico, witchcraft accusations flourished, often targeting women who practiced traditional healing or held community influence. Most accused witches had an indigenous or a mixed race background. But often this accusation of sorcery served to control any kind of female power or independence. Because what the Inquisition encountered in Mexico was something entirely new. Indigenous used, for instance, hallucinogenic plants for religious and healing purposes, right? We've got the mushrooms and the peyote and all sorts of powerful substances that had long been used for spiritual purposes, but for the Spanish, this seemed like demonic sort of activity. So there was the case of a Maria who was of mixed race origin. She was a folk healer, and she was caught with a certain herb that had been a hallucinogenic herb that was considered illegal. And she had all these medicinal plants and healing materials. And we have a case where in 1704 she was detained indefinitely, and we never know what happened to her after that. The Inquisition wasn't necessarily more brutal than secular courts at the time. They all had torture. Torture was a common part of detentions of all kinds. But what was going on here is that the psychological impact of the Inquisition was enormous. Neighbors began to accuse neighbors, family members would turn against each other. Women who had, herbalists or healers or community leaders were very vulnerable. And some of them fought back. Now, I will talk about chocolate in a moment, but why don't we, I'll probably come back to this slide and the next one. If you want to, is also a chocolate slide. I'm going to come back to that. And the next one, why don't we scroll forward to the unfortunate image, one more, of the woman. Yeah, so the case of the Witch of the Arches, the 17th century in San Luis Potosí. Maria Ignacia de Malto was a wealthy, influential woman who allegedly worked for a while for the Inquisition, using the ground floor of her building for torture and executions while living upstairs. Now, according to legend, she practiced witchcraft to kill her enemies, 30 men in important government positions, including former lovers who had rejected her. She rode through the city at night in a magnificent carriage drawn by 2 black horses, untouchable due to her position. Her downfall came when she murdered 2 men from families more powerful than her own. Sentenced to death for murder and witchcraft, she made one final request, permission to paint a mural on her home's wall. Granted this wish, she painted a lifelike image of herself in her carriage. To the amazement of watching officials, the painting came to life. La Maltos mounted the painted carriage and disappeared through the wall, never to be seen again. The building still stands in San Luis Potosí's historic district, and locals claim to hear spell chanting from within and see ghostly carriages emerging from the walls. One of the reasons I love the colonial period is because it's filled with mysteries and, marvels and mysteries and omens and not just in Mexico, colonial America is full of them too. It was an age, just before you get to the scientific revolution, you have to understand that the worldview is still magical. Everything's got a mystical, magical power. There's an eclipse. This means something significant, You have an epidemic, it's some mysterious thing in the air, maybe. The only response is going to be prayers and petitions or, you know the cannons that go off and kind of annoy you during the religious festivals and wake you up? That actually comes from epidemics, because they believed that epidemics were carried through the air. Miasma was the theory. Yeah. And the hope was if you shot a cannon off, you could knock this stuff out of the area, you know. And so the church, in dire moments, would be firing cannons and lighting fires and such. So we're dealing with magical stories here in many ways. I mean, on one level, we're dealing with great human suffering. On another level, as that slide in the torture do display. So I have another story for you, if you like that one. Let's go to the next slide. And, La Mulata de Córdoba. Okay, so in 16th century Veracruz, a beautiful herbalist named Soledad helped townspeople with her problems through her knowledge of plants and healing. While beloved by those she helped, she attracted resentment from envious women who suspected she had made a pact with the devil to maintain her youth and beauty, and from men frustrated by her refusal of romantic advances. Various versions of her story exist, but most agree that she was betrayed to the Inquisition, possibly by the mayor of Córdoba after she rejected his advances. Terrified witnesses claimed they saw her flying over rooftops at night and forcing people to buy love potions. Imprisoned and sentenced to burn at the stake, she made a simple request. Could the guard bring her charcoal to draw pictures on her cell wall? Uh-oh. The sympathetic guard watched in amazement as Soledad drew a detailed sailing ship on the ocean. When she asked what was missing from the picture, he replied that it needed someone to navigate it. You're right, she laughed, jumping aboard the painted ship and sailing away through the prison wall. People in Córdoba still report sightings of La Mulata flying overhead with gleaming dark eyes emerging from walls in a ghostly ship or appearing as an owl. Even former President Porfirio Diaz claimed to have seen her apparition. Which reminds me, you know, a lot of these presidents, even during the, modern era, Madero, you know, the father of the revolution, Francisco Madero was a spiritualist who visited, faith healers, as we would call them. Even Plutarco Calles, who was president in the 1920s and was the most anti-clerical president in Mexico's history, when it is said that he went to a famous healer in the north of Mexico at one point seeking healing. So there is a whole level of, healing culture that's very much alive in Mexico today, and it was during this period. But women of any kind of power and influence could often be targeted by the claim of witchcraft, as you know. It was more women were murdered in witchcraft trials in the Protestant countries by far than in Mexico. So of course you have the Salem witch trials, right, and the whole, but also in Europe, many women died. So it wasn't as prevalent in Mexico, but it was certainly present. And the legends also reveal, they're more than just folk tales. They reveal how people understood and resisted the Inquisition's power. They feature intelligent, capable women who refuse to accept the unjust punishment and escape through creativity and supernatural power, okay? So it's a bit of a lesson that way. And now I want to just talk about the chocolate brewing witches of colonial Mexico. And that, if you could go back to the slides and scroll up a couple to the earlier slides about the chocolate. Couple more. Well, it's 1, 2, and then one more before this. Yeah. These 3 slides, basically, they're just representations. Although the middle slide, if you go to the second one, that's actually from a manuscript, a codice, at the time of the conquest, so that was indigenous. The middle one more down, is you can see a woman brewing, brewing chocolate. So I don't know if you're aware of chocolate's really sacred origins in Mexico. It's not just a beverage, it's much, much more. So chocolate has a lot of power, and the Inquisition's persecution of women who allegedly used chocolate in magical practices reveals a lot of, and it's kind of an intersection of colonial anxieties about race and gender and indigenous spiritual traditions in Latin America in the 1600s and 1700s. So a word about chocolate's sacred origins. Indigenous people cultivated chocolate for over 3,000 years. They used it in diplomatic ceremonies and marriage rituals. You can actually see it in carvings of, at a sacred ceremony, they'll be holding a beverage. It was, in pre-colonial time, it was associated with vitality, life force. It was really blood, the blood of life. Kind of was, represented blood in a symbolic way. And women traditionally prepared chocolate, grinding cacao beans and mixing them with spices like vanilla. Now, the Spanish adopted chocolate drinking while prohibiting other indigenous ritual practices. So they did like the chocolate part. They decided to keep that. Of course, when it went over to Europe, it was considered a little too bitter, so they added, sugar at that point, and it became a worldwide beverage. In the late 1600s, it became an everyday beverage in colonial society, as common as morning coffee is today. And it retained some ritual significance, but it also became commercialized, okay? So there was, in this Inquisition process, there were several stages. The initial stage in the early 1500s was pretty brutal. It was a persecution of indigenous elites, who were trying to hold on to their indigenous customs, especially their spiritual customs. And so they would be made an example of as a way of saying, if there's a new order in town, there's a new sheriff, get on board with Catholicism, or you're going to be treated like these, like your leaders. Make an example of them. So the elite, their children were taken from them and then trained by the missionaries. So they were basically, re-educated, in a new system from an early age. And of course, this continued right into the Native American schools that Canada and the US have had to deal with, the legacy in recent decades, right, of that educational process of bringing indigenous children into a school and forbidding them to speak their language, and that whole system. So anyway, that goes back to the 1500s as kind of the first wave. But later in the 1600s, you get more of a policing of the mixed race population. Colonial authorities were outnumbered, and they realized it. Europeans only ever comprised 15% of the population in the Americas, And women bore the brunt of the persecution, particularly if they crossed boundaries, either, education-wise, racially. Spanish, indigenous, African, and mixed-race women, they shared knowledge of their healing practices across cultural lines. So there was a solidarity there among women. Often targeted, however, it turns out, are single women, widows, or anyone who challenged any kind of traditional gender role. So chocolate becomes a vehicle for resistance. And here are some notable cases. Melchora de las Reyes was a mixed-race woman who used magical powders in her unfaithful lover's chocolate to make him subject to her will. So you'll find many, many cases I've read about where, for instance, one woman will come to another, often a Spanish or Creole woman will come to a mixed race woman for kind of spiritual advice in these arts, saying, my husband is straying from me, how do I, bring him back? And the healer would have a very specific set of guidelines. Some of them could be kind of interesting, you need to have a clipping of his toenails, and a clipping of his hair, and you got to mix it in, and all sorts of things, and then he'll be subject to your will, Yeah. Cecilia de Fuentes was accused of bewitching her husband because she was forcing him to serve her morning chocolate. Imagine that. Francisca de Agreda and her daughter Juana, they mixed pubic hair and nail clippings into chocolate and served it to a priest. Maria de Santos Inés fed enemies bewitched chocolate pastries, okay? She was called La Panecito. And Doña Luisa de Galvez used chocolate mixed with magical powders to try to stop her husband's domestic violence. So you see that everyday real problems, a straying husband, domestic violence, how do you redeem these or do something about these, fix these. So you're left with a magical solution. So there was, even though there was this attempt to stamp out these folk traditions, Latin American communities continued practicing folk healing arts. And women used chocolate-based magic to assert their agency, sometimes to seek revenge or escape oppressive situations. And it was a fusion, you had a fusion of indigenous, African, and European spiritual traditions. Okay? So I think with the chocolate witchcraft trials, there's a whole bunch of them in the files, demonstrate how colonial people, or colonized people even, I could say, adapted and preserved their traditions within a system that was trying to stamp them out, women playing a crucial role. And the Spanish colonial project, even though it had an extensive reach, it ultimately failed to completely suppress the, quote, magic of everyday women. So, any questions or comments about that? Let's see if, yeah, go ahead. Oh, with a, microphone, right? Thanks.
Yeah, you mentioned something really interesting early on, that the crown in Spain had forbidden persecution of people who had not converted to Catholicism. But then it seems like as time went on, did this get forgotten, or were all these people who were being persecuted for their chocolate, were they kind of like half converted to Catholicism, or?
Yeah, they would have been baptized, because if that still held, if they were not, indigenous communities that lived apart in the Republic of the Indias, they were called, they had their separate communities, were 100% indigenous, and that maintained pretty much through the entire colonial period. So we're not talking about those people. They were not involved in the Inquisition. These were people who lived in the, Christianized, mixed society. They were servants, domestic servants, mixed-race people, living in various levels of freedom, like the case of the woman who had to petition for her freedom. They were Christian women who were being brought before the Inquisition, yeah. But they maintained these practices which weren't seen by the women as being anti-Christian. They were, women's magic. You know, how do you keep a husband from straying? You know, women talk to women about that. You know, what's the secret? You know, well, you have to mix a little of this and a little of that, and hope for the best, I guess. So yeah, that's, I think, why they were brought before the Inquisition. And any practice that had any kind of ritual element to it was considered threatening. You know, because it could be you know, harken back to the indigenous days, you know, in their spirituality. So, and many of these people that were folk heroes had some sort of indigenous background in them, right? And to this day, if you've been to any kind of curandero or anybody like that, has anyone had any kind of consultations or gone anything, or any of the people that work for them? Do you want to say a word about that? What kind of people were they seeing or giving the consultations? Were they, did they have an indigenous background?
They
or
usually,
yeah.
from what I've seen it, they've definitely been indigenous.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's the community that kind of preserves this tradition. Yeah.
There are a lot of the Mayans in Chiapas who have clinics, you know, and people come and it's all ritualized. And,
Sure.
And very, very interesting because you can sit and watch it. And I was really surprised, you know, seeing this young couple brought in this newborn or very little baby, you know, and the baby, I couldn't hear, they were speaking another language that I didn't know, but they were clearly really worried about this baby, and I gathered that the baby wouldn't eat, you know, was not nursing.
Right.
And they were just thought it was, you know, frightening them, so they came to the curandero guy, and he did the egg ceremony, which is sort of multi-purpose, you know, cracking an egg into water, or putting an egg into water and seeing if it floats or if it falls to the bottom, which has to do with whether it's been fertilized or not, and how old the egg is. And so you have two answers possible, and he would pick the egg and put it in there, and the baby's fine, you know. He'd say that you have a very, very healthy baby, and you are very, very good parents. And, you know, it was really interesting. You just really calmed them down, but by using this symbolism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, sure. You know, you think about what are your options for healthcare when you don't have any system or recourses. You know, you go to people who can help and reassure you, and we all know the power of the placebo effect, right? You're giving somebody medicine. It may not really have any active ingredient in it, but they will still show a remarkable level of recovery. There's a question here in the...
Yeah. My wife and I went on a textile and weaving 10-day tour in Chiapas around 3 years ago. And part of what was fascinating was the discussion within the group by the leader that there's been a massive exodus of families from the Catholic Church to evangelical churches. And part of the reason for that is that wife beating and drunk husbands were basically accepted within the Catholic Church, and the priest would simply say, you're not a good enough wife. And the evangelical churches will not tolerate domestic violence, and they will not tolerate drunkenness.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. I want to respond to that before we get another question, because you're not a plant. I will testify. That was not a planted question, but that was my master's thesis in Latin American studies, was the growth of evangelical Protestantism in Mexico and Latin America. And precisely the theme that you're reaching is, at the core of it, is the women find that they found a community that empowers them and there's a wonderful book called The Reformation of Machismo. And it's Elizabeth Brusco, an anthropologist. She was writing about Colombia, I believe, not Mexico, but it's the same principle. And that her studies showed that when a woman joins evangelical church, you get an immediate community of support that has very high moral standards, does not tolerate not only the beating and all that, the domestic abuse, but the wasting of the household resources through gambling and drinking and carousing. And if a man wants to stay in the household, he has to convert and become, upright living. And if he doesn't, she's got a community of support. And that's what she didn't have in the Catholic Church, right? Which was telling her to just, suffer, or to bear your cross, And so thank you for bringing that up. It's a crucial insight on the growth of evangelical Protestant. And I will tell you that on any given Sunday, yes, we have a question, but I love this little fact. There are more evangelicals going to church in Latin America than Catholics because they're more church going. And the other part about that, the model is much more of a franchise model, if we want to put it in business. You open a little storefront in a community, but the advantage is you're in the neighborhood, people can come into your door. The church is very much right with the community. It's not this big building that was built 3 centuries ago with hard pews that nobody's in, and you won't find anybody home. So the evangelical churches, empower all their members to be active, and it's a very effective growth strategy. Yeah.
My observation is, I've observed something, you're a Catholic, you go to Mass, you sit by yourself, and then you go home. After the Protestant service, you go and have food with people, you socialize. There's a family. I think there's a big attraction.
Yeah,
too.
support,
The
community.
social.
Yeah, yeah. And having said that, and before, we're going to get your question, but if it's not on the same subject, I just want to follow up to say that became the source of the Catholic movement in liberation theology, of the base community movement, okay? Which the base Christian community of the Catholic tradition was to find that level of community support, of a smaller scale gathering, people's homes, where people could work their faith out in daily life. It wasn't so remote and cold and distant and removed. And I know when I moved to Mexico, at one point, walking into a Catholic church, when I had been very active in a house church, Catholic church in the U.S., where we met in people's homes, and I came down here and I went to church, and I felt like I'd stepped back about 4 centuries, remote person up there, and no interaction. So, yeah, these are important factors but the reformation of machismo, the empowerment of women through the evangelical churches is a key insight. Thank you. Okay, thanks for being patient.
So, going back to the curanderos, we can't downplay the knowledge that a lot of these indigenous healers had across all the Americas, with so many different herbs and plants, and that it wasn't just a placebo effect, but there was legitimate healings that occurred.
Oh, yes. Yes, it's more than placebo. In the case of, cracking an egg and saying you're a good mother, that might be just, the encouragement there. But in terms of the herbs, I want to recommend another book called Indian Givers. It's a great title. It's about the heritage of indigenous knowledge of plants, animals, and to the world. Everything from quinine, which became the first, cure or response for malaria. All of the, of course, all of the wonderful fruits and vegetables and things, the tomato cured scurvy in Europe, the potato, the famine, the orange, The Indian Givers is a wonderful book of precisely what you're talking about, is the incredible power of some of these medicinal, healing plants and herbs. Not only healing, but then you've got the hallucinogenic side too, which can, became, of course, very popular in the 60s. Maria Sabina was had a following of hippies coming down, and that's how LSD and psilocybin came to the U.S. and became, the whole flower culture of the 60s and the hippies. It actually comes from Mexico. So thanks. That's a good point. Yeah, I don't want to at all minimize the actual healing powers of these people. Although, having said that, there's also a lot of charlatans, and there have been people, John of God, I think was the, do you know the story of John of God? Yeah, he was, had a lot of abuse surrounding his cures, but yeah, any other stories of Carlos Castaneda's? Yeah. Yeah, no, I'd love, definitely recommend reading something of his. I remember reading a book of his back in the 80s or whatever. Yeah, The Journey to Ixtlan or one of those, and the stories of Don Juan, and interesting character of his own right. And kind of, there have been several, even the Toltec one, the Four Promises, or the Four, thank you, Four Agreements, is that it? Supposedly Toltec knowledge, is it really? Is it somebody using it for profit, At the same time, there's a lot of wisdom in those stories, and, a lot of insights as well. So I highly recommend looking more into that. Yeah. So we're not going to have to leave at 12:30, but at the same time, I don't want to push too much, longer than people want to sit. I can talk about some more colonial practices of marriage, and if that's of interest. It's a little drier, I think. Legal changes in status for women among the educational colonial period. Let me see if I can find something a little more juicy, because I know it can get a little dry. How about sexuality and social control? That's always fun, right? So categories of sexual transgression. Okay. And this is again from the Inquisition. There was a lot of detailed testimonies about sexual practice, and there have been books written about the, what is the word now? Voyeuristic aspect of, you've got a celibate, supposedly celibate priesthood, interrogating people about their sexual practices in great detail sometimes. So I just kind of leave that as it is. But a lot of detailed testimonies in the Inquisition records about sexual practices, marriage disputes, adultery cases, accusations of social deviance or sexual deviance. That they reveal kind of normative expectations, here's what the standard is, and then actual practices. So, one of the things that's always difficult is to uncover what layer we're on, and when we're looking at like the church has certain rules about marriage and what's permitted, what's prohibited, and then you get the testimony of how people are actually living their lives, So some of the categories of sexual, quote, transgression. Bigamy cases reveal patterns of serial marriage and mobility. So again, you're dealing with people on many levels who are scrambling to make a living. Mortality, life is short, people are dying. Spouses, you may have married with the intention of monogamy, but if your spouse is dead and you're still young and alone, or you have children now, you need to be with someone, you need some support. You get all sorts of stories of this. People abandoning their family, adultery accusations that often illuminate gender double standards in community surveillance. So things were permitted for men that weren't permitted for women. Then you have accusations of sodomy that have, and other, quote, unnatural acts that have insight into same-sex relationships. Cases involving clergy reveal widespread clergy, concubine practices of living with women, not acknowledging them as their partners. So those can be used in historical analysis, with some care, in interpreting them. So basically, the religious project involved a lot of regulation of sexuality, perhaps because it's a powerful force and one that the church has always had a somewhat problematic relationship with, churches in general, perhaps more so the Catholic Church because of the issues of celibacy. And I think you know that the church, the priesthood wasn't always celibate. It was only about the 8th or 9th century that became an absolute law, and it had a lot to do with property. Because if you had a family and you were a priest, then it becomes a problem of inheritance of the church, who's going to get the church? And so it's also a mechanism, can be a mechanism of control. At the same time, it can be a path, a legitimate path to, a spiritual focus of life. But generally speaking, that happens most successfully in religious orders where you have a community, you're living together, So anyway, some of the areas of regulation included confession and spiritual direction. So that was a big one, right? Confession provides the church with detailed knowledge of individual sexual practices and opportunity for direct intervention. You had confessional manuals with appropriate questions, penances for various sexual transgressions were laid out. Marriage preparation, the church required extensive preparation for marriage, still does. That, I think, is a good idea. I think always. If anybody who's entering into that kind of commitment should, have thought about it in various ways. Investigation of impediments, previous marriages, and all sorts of things. But it also could be a method of surveillance of people, monitoring of married life. Priests were very involved in the moral, monitoring the moral behavior of married couples, intervening in cases of domestic violence, adultery, other issues. So you can see that, I hope it's helpful to see that the church was very much involved in the daily life in this era of the community. And this would have been before there was evangelical churches, or anything like that. So the Catholic Church did operate much more on a local, personal level with people. Then you had religious lay organizations, fraternities and things like that. And they also had a role to play. So just give you an idea for that. I think I'll end today with just a little bit introduction to the independence movement and into some of the women involved in the independence movement, because this is now 1810 to 1821. This was when Mexico fought for its independence from Spain. It was all of Latin America was involved in revolutions of independence during this decade, basically. And so some of these people you may have heard of. Josefa Ortiz de Dominguez was the wife of a very important official in Querétaro. Ortiz had a unique position in that she could bring conspirators together who were planning this revolution, but she could hide it under this veil of respectability because she was an important official. And the interesting story about her is she lived with her uncle and they had a printing press. And at night, she would use that printing press to crank out, pamphlets for the revolution, right? they also had these circles of people that would come together and talk about revolutionary ideas, and they would trade books from Europe on, the independence of France and the French Revolution, right? And of course the US Revolution. These were all ideas in the air, and they were all, of course, banned by the Inquisition. But Josefa Ortiz had this printing press, and she got word that they'd been discovered and that authorities would be coming and, locking people up and locking them out of the building and all that. So they dismantled the printing press. And, women at those times wore these big billowy skirts with all sorts of pockets. And the women actually put the pieces of the printing press in their billowy skirts and moved it to another location, and, because they couldn't be searched. So very resourceful. She ended up being locked up for a number of years, but she persisted. Leona Vicario is another name that you may have run across. She was a wealthy Mexican, Mexico City woman who financed the independence activity, and also the women served as the couriers, transmitting these messages, because they could hide them all over their bodies and, carry them, and they wouldn't be searched. So there were these elite women networks. And remember that the independence revolution in Mexico, as it was in the US, it was an elite versus elite movement to start. The masses join in at certain points, but what was the real fight here was between the peninsulars who had run everything and then these Creole Spanish who were born in Mexico. And yeah, they might have had a comfortable life, but they were not allowed into leadership, They couldn't be they could be a priest, but maybe not a bishop, or a small bishop, but not an archbishop, and they could be, they could run a little town council or something, but they weren't going to be elected to major positions. So they began, resisting. And they had help from, some Enlightenment priests. Padre Hidalgo is the famous one, right, who started it off. But the women had unique roles as spies and also combatants, intelligent networks, because they could move between the domestic and public space, and that made them good agents of intelligence. They could gather intelligence in their interactions without avoiding too much suspicion from the male, authorities. Some women actually did get involved directly in military operations, usually at this point as support in camp followers, nurses, suppliers. Some took up arms, however. They could also be speakers, public speakers. Now, the war did have an impact on family structures, which is pretty, obvious to consider. So all sorts of new households begin to develop, demographic changes, military casualties and displacement. You've got all that going on. They lose a lot of male population, so you have more female-headed households, economic disruption, displacement and immigration. You'll see a lot more of this in the Mexican Revolution a century later as well. But there was a lot of legal uncertainty, the breakdown of the colonial systems, that had been so controlling for 3 centuries. When you think about it, Spain managed at a distance where it took a month to get a message from Spain to the Americas, just for it to arrive, things would have changed dramatically on the ground. But, in the 2-month back and forth, that's a lifetime of change. But somehow they managed to have this effective control for 3 centuries, and now it's all breaking down in 1 decade, right? Think about how that creates uncertainty about everything from how to regulate marriage to inheritance, family relationships. Now you've got widowhood and female-headed households. So you've got a lot going on at this period. and you've got a lot of changing gender expectations. So, you know, the question in the new Republic of Mexico was, what is a woman's status? You know, what is it going to be in terms of education, legal citizenship? Women were not granted political rights right away, but they were considered members of the community with certain protections, obligations. That was nice of the men, right? You can be part of the community. Well, yeah, I think so, if you want to continue. But there were a lot of debates over, you know, a woman's political participation, you know, what would they be allowed or permitted or was appropriate. There was a lot of debate about women's roles going on. So you see, as Mexico, as in the US, as in Europe, the influence of Enlightenment ideas and early feminist writing, very early sense of educational reforms. So we begin to see some of these developments in Mexico around the time of independence. Okay. Let's see if there's anything else really juicy here, because I can go into detail on custody and children's rights and all sorts of things. But is there anything about what we've covered today that is either confusing, surprising, or in our final minutes you'd like to just have anything that, anybody learn anything today? Was it, you did? Okay. Well, that's good. Well, I think it's probably then a good place to wrap it up. It's you know, it's been a good long day. I think when I get it, where I pick up tomorrow will be in the mid-century. We get a whole crisis of the reform movement, and that's a whole different moment. So this is a good moment to end. Aditi, do you have anything to say? Remember to sign up for lunch on Saturday if you haven't. And